Welcome back to Tip of the Spear with your Missoula County Commissioners. I'm Juanita Vero, and here with my fellow commissioners Dave Strohmeyer and Josh Slotnick. And today we're joined by Elena Evans, the Environmental Health Manager for Missoula City County Health Department. And we're going to be talking all things Smurfit-Stone paper mill. So thanks for joining us, Elena.
I'm always happy to talk about Smurfit.
Well, can I break the ice
Please
here?
do,
So if someone is new to Montana, new to Missoula County, and has not driven around out in the Frenchtown area pre-2010 and happened to be out there today, they would probably be driving by and see something that looked somewhat apocalyptic. You got an industrial site that's broken down. People might be wondering, what is this? And we refer to it endearingly as Smurfit-Stone container, which bespeaks part of its history. But take us back in time a little bit as far as what is that site?
Yeah, that's a great way to start us off, especially for people who aren't here to smell the mill.
Yeah.
That
Right.
was a very big presence in our community earlier on. So in the 1950s, Montana was a really big forestry industry business. And so there was a lot of effort in the area to try and find a way to use some of the smaller trees and limbs and things that weren't being used for lumber or white pine sash or things that were bigger. And so this pulp mill idea came into fruition, and the site was decided upon as a great opportunity because there was lots of water and they could discharge the wastewater products associated with pulp mill processes into the Clark Fork River.
So, Elena, I don't mean to interrupt. When you say pulp mill, what does that mean they're making? What's made out there?
So there's pictures of giant mounds of scraps of wood, and it goes through a number of processes to kind of break it down and make it into either pulp for paper or pulp for craft products. And
Does that
craft
mean
products
cardboard?
are like the outside of cardboard. So not the corrugated inside part, but the outside sheeting that kind of holds that together. And so you'd get scraps of wood. You'd have to go through this pretty intensive chemical process to break all of those wood products down into that pulp in a fine matter that you could then make into paper.
And they were actually making the paper out there, or some of the products.
So they made mostly craft liner paper.
The liner board.
Yeah,
Okay.
and so it wasn't necessarily a lot of final products, but the intermediate step. And it was an important place for that excess forestry product to get processed into something that was more easily shipped to manufacturers.
So it closed in 2010, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, I still have memories of being up at Snowball on a clear day and looking west, and you just see the plume of smoke going up into the air. It's also sad for all the folks who had jobs out there. There were thousands and thousands of people that were employed. So what happened after the place closed?
In 2010, in order to deal with some bankruptcy procedures, Smurfit-Stone shut down the mill with weeks' notice, and those employees were then out of a job for the foreseeable future. So that was problematic for a number of reasons.
How many employees we're talking about? There was over 400, I thought.
Yeah, there were 417 employees at the time that it shut down, and a third of those employees had worked there for more than 30 years.
Wow.
So that's pretty hard if you start out there in high school and you're not quite ready to retire,
With just a few weeks' notice.
Was there ever a time when that number was larger?
Yeah, the number of tons per day that were produced varied from 600 tons per day to up to 1,900 tons per day. Wow. So I would anticipate at that higher peak production that there were more employees.
Okay.
At the end there, they were kind of
Trailing
slowing
off.
down
Yeah.
anyhow.
And over the, I guess, basically 50 to 60 year lifespan of operations out there, there was more than one company who owned the property, and this might relate to what we're going to talk about a little bit later in terms of who might be responsible for what happens next out there.
Yeah, it started off as Horner Waldorf, but then there were a number of conglomerations and purchases by other companies. Those kind of also coincided with ups and downs in the paper industry and the forestry industry in western Montana. It started off in 1957, Smurfit-Stone, that's when it was created, and then it kept growing. And as it kept growing, it also started to slowly implement some of the environmental procedures that were required at that point in time. So, for example, right after it opened, there was a big plume of wastewater that went I think 20 miles downstream that caused a giant fish kill. And so that was when they changed how they were operating and started digging some of the 900 acres of wastewater treatment ponds.
Just got to step back and say that again. 900 acres of wastewater treatment ponds.
That's correct.
That's just something to kind of hold in your mind and try and apprehend visually what 900 acres of wastewater treatment ponds might even look like. What's a treatment pond? What does that mean?
Well, that kind of changed through time as well. So initially, after that fish kill, they just sent someone out with big equipment to start digging holes to kind of hold that water back until there was high water, because that way any of the wastewater that they put into the Clark Fork River would be diluted. And so the hope would be it wouldn't.
So just sort of crudely, they put the bad water aside in a big pond. And then when the Clark Fork was flooding, when it was high water, they released the bad water into the Clark Fork.
Yeah.
That was the plan.
That was the plan after.
Dilution is the solution.
Dilution is the solution.
It is true in a lot of regards.
Dilution's the solution to pollution.
Yeah, I was waiting for that one.
But
yeah.
don't eat the
Put
fish.
that in your resolution.
Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, well, and so that was just the beginning. So it didn't start off as 900 acres of ponds. They kind of kept digging them. And then as environmental standards came into the picture in the 60s and 70s, there were more requirements for discharge permits from the Department of Environmental Quality. And some of those were how much they could change the color of the Clark Fork River, or how much total dissolved solids, so how much stuff could be in the water. And that was really what the discharge permits could require at that point in time. But they did result in more ponds, and eventually they resulted in a clarifier. So this big arm that kind of swept styrofoam and big chunks of things off of the wastewater before it went into
something like you'd see in a sewage treatment facility.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. They kind of kept adding on, but as the wastewater went through the different ponds, stuff settled out. That was the whole point. It would settle stuff out and leave it on the bottom. Eventually, some of those ponds got clogged up, and they tried these aeration basins where they tried to shove water into the wastewater and sludge to cause more stuff to drop out. So all this is to essentially say that the site's pretty heterogeneous. So it's pretty different at depth and across the site, so that, just because you poke a hole in one place doesn't mean that'll look the same in that same pond in a different place.
So the stuff that you describe as dropping out is presumably stuff that you would not want to eat.
I certainly don't.
What sort of contaminants might we be talking about here?
It kind of breaks out into two different pieces of contamination. And the first one is dioxins and furans. And they're the byproduct of pulp mills specifically. That's because the pulp was often bleached so that that paperboard liner could be, printed on. And so for 39 out of the 50 years that it operated, it bleached a lot of that pulp, and that created dioxins and furans. In fact, there was a study by the EPA in the 80s that showed that 95% of all sludge coming out of craft pulp mills contained dioxins and furans, and 85% of wastewater did. It broke it down a lot more, but that study included Smurfit-Stone.
And what do dioxins and furans do to a person or the environment?
That's a great question. Dioxins and furans are hydrophobic, so they don't like water. And that's in part because they like fats. And so they're kind of connect to those tissues more. And because of that, they biomagnify, bioaccumulate. So that means if you're the tiniest fish and you're a bigger fish and you eat a bunch of tiny fish, the dioxins and furans stay in the bigger fish. So then if you're a person and you eat that big
persists.
fish, yeah,
Up the chain.
It stays with you. It's not released from your body.
And are these carcinogens? What's the ultimate bad thing that it can do?
Yeah, so there are risks. There are cancer risks, and there are risks just associated with dioxins. And that's further compounded by the other set of contaminants that were also caused by Smurfit-Stone, which is the heavy metals. If a tree's growing, it will pull up into its body mass manganese and arsenic and metals associated with the soil and the rocks that it's growing on. And when that pulping process takes place, those heavy metals in some ways will drop out. And then on top of that, though wastewater had a really high pH, it was very acidic. There was just a lot of different chemical processes involved. And so when the chemicals in the wastewater moved to the ponds, it changed how the ponds operated, causing some of the metals in the soil and rocks to also leach out. So the wastewater itself also caused more contamination by pulling more metals out.
Wow. Okay, so we're establishing that these ponds were pretty darn contaminated because of what was put in there, and also because, as you just said, of the interaction between what was put in there and the kind of native geology of the place. So flash forward 2010, the company goes away. Who's responsible for cleaning this up?
What happened in 2010 was Missoula County, folks in Frenchtown, and other stakeholders like Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai asked the EPA to take a look at the site and determine if it should be added to the national priority list, which is the list of the most contaminated sites in the United States.
We're number one.
The
We're
EPA is going to try and address. And so that was shortly after the mill closed down. So we kind of started into that EPA process. And
did they come out and take a look?
They took a look. There was a preliminary assessment, and the EPA said, hey, folks who bought out Smurfit-Stone container, you're probably going to be responsible for this. Do you want to get on the national priority list, or do you want to sign this agreement to follow the Superfund process and adhere to the rules and regulations associated with it? And so International Paper and WestRock agreed to sign this agreement to follow the process. And so that kind of started things off. And we are now in the Superfund snake process, which has a number of different steps and stages.
So is it basically everyone who owned this property going back to 1957-ish who would be a potentially responsible party for paying for what it costs to clean this thing up?
In a way, yes, but that's because all of the pieces eventually got sold to the companies that signed that agreement. And it wasn't just those companies that operated it. It was also M2 Green, which is an LLC that we understand to be currently bankrupt, also signed that agreement. And so just because the potentially responsible parties, the parties who will be paying for the cleanup under that agreement with the EPA, have been determined at this point in time, it doesn't mean that, say, the current owner or a future owner might not also be included at the end of this EPA process.
Elena, what happens if, say, the EPA figures out what's there, and then they write up a prescription, and then they tell the PRPs, okay, now you guys got to pay for this and follow the prescription and get it cleaned up. And the PRPs say, wait a minute, that prescription you just wrote up costs $2 billion, and we're Horner Waldorf. We haven't been in business since the Eisenhower administration, right? We don't have any money. Sorry, we can't help.
This is under CERCLA, which is the Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act. And that was created in 1980 and helped create the Environmental Protection Agency. So that came out of Love Canal and those environmental disasters that we're aware of. And what that did is it tried to make it the responsibility of the companies that created the environmental disasters to clean it up and put it back into a reasonable use. But it's called the Superfund process because if the companies that created the mess are no longer in business or able to pay for it, then the funding to do so should come out of this Superfund.
Also, a specific fund that's been created just for this purpose.
Correct.
So how does that work in this case where even though the process is paralleling as if it was already on the national priority list, but not formally listed as a Superfund site, would there still be the opportunity to tap into the Superfund
if we're not a Superfund?
If these other parties that might bear some responsibility are nowhere to be seen anymore.
International Paper and WestRock bought the components of Smurfit-Stone, and so they're the responsible parties at this point in time from that business perspective, and that's something that the EPA tracked back through and sent documents and things like that. So the EPA's responsibility for the due diligence associated with finding those responsible parties, and they're responsible for saying, this is what we found, this is what you have to do to clean it up. And there's a couple different ways in which they can do that. So it's cost savings for the potentially responsible parties to engage with the EPA, but the EPA can also do some of the actions and then basically send them the bill and say, this is what you're responsible for, this is what you have to pay for.
What's Missoula County's involvement, or more specifically, how does this impact our taxpayers?
Well, right now, since the entity that currently owns that property isn't paying taxes, it means that Frenchtown schools don't have all the funds they need to, pay the bus drivers. And
sorry to interrupt. I just got to be clear. Entity that owns that land is not paying taxes?
Yeah, I can't speak for the landowner, but they haven't paid their taxes right now.
So they're delinquent in their taxes.
Correct. They're delinquent in their taxes right now. And in the past, Missoula County has had to take them to court in order to recoup the costs for largely the Frenchtown School District. It's also Missoula County and fire. And
what kind of dollars are we talking about?
Right now, we're talking about $750,000 across all the entities that own those parcels. So M2 Green, that company I spoke about earlier, that's included on the administrative order of consent, is currently very delinquent. That's the majority of those taxes, and they seem to be non-existent.
Is there a P.O. box in the Caymans or in Delaware?
So we've got multiple problems, it sounds like, going on simultaneously. We've got an environmental mess that needs to be cleaned up. We've got property owners who are not carrying and shouldering their obligation to pay their taxes, and it leaves the community in a position of a property that could otherwise be really productive for economic development, natural resources, that's kind of stuck right now.
Yeah. And so to add to the mess, and please correct me if I'm wrong in here, we don't yet have agreement on the nature of the problem. Can you describe that piece of this?
Yeah, that's correct. So the site as a whole is 3,200 acres.
Ooh, that's so big.
And we were talking about 900 acres of wastewater treatment ponds. Some of those ponds have had very limited samples. We're talking about 1 or 2 samples in 100 acres to see how much of these contaminants are in the soil.
And you said it's a very heterogeneous site, meaning it's different everywhere. It's not like you take one sample and now you know what the place is.
And besides the ponds themselves, I've heard of there being dumps out there that might contain other types of substances.
Yeah, there's 193 acres of sludge and dumps. So all of the stuff from the lunchroom, Rager wire, kiln grits, all sorts of industrial wastes that were just put into some of those ponds that had been dug out when they were no longer serving as ponds. They kind of got switched into dumps. Well, and on top of that, too, there were a number of employee reports about different spills of PCB oils and barrels that were placed out there and things like that remain of concern for the county, the residents out there, and everything like that. And our estimation right now is that the density and how much sampling has occurred doesn't really take into account the concerns of the community or how scientifically you'd need to go about figuring out risk.
Speaking of risk, well, my understanding is that there is a system of berms, not engineered levees by a long shot, but berms out there that contain that wastewater that you were describing earlier. And there was a big concern a few years ago that, well, what happens if the cleanup has not commenced and the high water, the flood waters, breach the berms? What is that going to do to the entire Clark Fork watershed? And maybe this was driven home even a little bit more this last year when there was a significant flooding around Yellowstone National Park, and just realizing that there could be these catastrophic events of runoff that create circumstances that might be a 500-year flood. Where does that leave us out there?
The permitting agencies that are usually associated with levees and things that are adjacent to waterways did not permit those. They are not constructed, and they are very concerning. 530 acres are considered floodplain that are behind the berms that really impede and move the Clark Fork River over up against the mountains. That causes not a lot of room for the Clark Fork River to move. And in 2018, there were high flows. And those folks who were out there to look at it said they could feel the berm moving and shaking, and there were boils. So water from the river was coming up into the ponds and causing water features. And
That's probably not a good thing.
well, I don't think anyone who was out there felt too safe.
Okay.
And then water from the site is leaving, and you could see it going into the Clark Fork River. Wow. That was a 1 in 25 year recurrence interval flood, which is just an estimate of how likely that amount of water might occur in that reach. And so that's not too frequent. It's higher than we've had, for most of the site's life, but that's how frequency and recurrence intervals work. If we're thinking about what happened over in Yellowstone, that was a 1 in 500 year of it, with the berms shaking and needing to be reinforced and leaking and having all those issues with a 1 in 25 year recurrence interval. I don't even want to think about a 1 in 500. I'm worried about anything greater than 25.
So, Elena, a lot of people have pointed out that, man, we need more land for housing. We need more land for industry. We need more land for agriculture. There's a whole lot of land out there. You said 3,200 acres. When can the greater we start doing any of those things out there?
So the site was cut up into different operable units. And operable unit 1 is considered the agricultural land. So that was the land that didn't have a lot of industrial activity. That was used primarily leased out for agriculture. So that's already kind of been returned to the public. But the 100-acre industrial core and the 900 acres of wastewater treatment ponds are still going through this process.
So when you said that other land's been returned to the public, what does that mean?
Operable Unit 1, they did some testing, and historically it was leased out to local farmers and ranchers for grazing. Given its historic use, they didn't do as much testing as they did on site. Now some of that has been sold and
Can it be developed?
It can be developed.
So we're talking a couple thousand acres there.
It's at least 1,000.
At least 1,000. Okay, so that 1,000 acres could right now support housing or industry or commercial development.
Yeah, and most of that land is on the other side of Mullen Road. So if we think about the site,
North side of Mullen.
Yeah, the north side of Mullen. That property was purchased back in the 50s and as it became available for potential site expansion, but the site never ended up really using it or expanding.
In what you're describing as operable Unit 1 with the ag lands, if development could occur there by way of housing, can folks actually drink the water?
It's a really good question.
Putting a house on the property is one thing. Being able to have any water to drink.
Demonstrating some excited eyebrows.
Because the groundwater probably doesn't recognize borders between operable units.
Very true. So the groundwater out there is concerning. There are some wells, but they aren't sampled quarterly. And like we talked about, dioxins and furans are hydrophobic. So it's really hard to find them, but they're toxic at very small quantities.
Ooh.
We're concerned about the groundwater out there because when the site was operating, it was pulling out 15 million gallons per day of groundwater. So it created this cone of depression.
Okay, can you stop there for just a moment? 15 million gallons of water per day. What do you think the city of Missoula, not Missoula County, but the city of Missoula, and I'm bringing up the city because they have their own water system. You're saying 15 million gallons a day?
Correct.
Okay, according to the Oracle at Delphi here, hidden in my phone, the average American family uses 300 gallons of water per day. Probably 20,000 households, 25,000 households in the city.
While we're computing, I think we're talking a lot of water.
Okay, that's 7.5 million gallons. If there's 25,000 households within the city's water system, 7.5 million a day, and you're saying the mill was using how many millions?
15 million.
Yeah.
Basically, twice the amount of water that the city of Missoula uses on any given day was used out there at Smurfit-Stone.
Every day.
Every day.
It was pulled out of the ground and moved through the plant and into the wastewater treatment plants. Groundwater at the site is super complicated because they were pulling so much water out of the aquifer and then putting it on the wastewater treatment ponds. So it kind of pushed groundwater in all of these different directions. Mm. And that hasn't yet been addressed in the studies that the EPA has the potentially responsible parties doing.
So it could be that...
Why not? What's the strategy or what EPA's side of the story?
Well, EPA does have to deal with and talk with the potentially responsible parties who are not interested or invested in spending more money on this site. They don't own the property anymore, and they, for the most part, don't do business in Montana.
So EPA doesn't really have the authority or power to say, you're going to clean it up to X standard. They now have to play a
or do they have the
complicated role?
Or do they have the power? But the risk is that they would be sued, and they don't have strong enough case to make that.
Definitely seems like we've got some competing values here, where for the community and for local government, we want to see this area cleaned up to the best standard possible as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the PRPs who have to pay for it want to spend as little money as possible. And those two goals do not necessarily coincide in one result. The EPA, it sounds like, is kind of playing the role of referee in the middle of all this. They're not going to make demands of the PRPs. You guys have to clean up this way, unless they feel so confident in their convictions that they would go to court and stand behind them.
That's correct. And that's why over the past 13 years, Missoula County stakeholders such as Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have documented all of the concerns with the sampling. And thanks to the commissioners reaching out to Casey Becker, who is the head of the EPA for Region 8, we are about to start discussions with the EPA about how to remedy those oversights in previous sampling.
One thing I want to add to this is we have seen with the change in presidential administrations, a change in the upper level and local level of administration within the EPA. And though we may locally feel like, man, the EPA was not really listening to us in the past, there's a whole new set of players right now. And we're embarking on a new chapter. And a little optimism, I think, is okay to have at this point, because we have a new person managing the site. We have a new regional director, as you mentioned. Could be a new day.
But then, like what you just said, though, change of administration in a few years.
Time
Correct.
to strike while the iron is hot.
Yes. Correct. All correct.
So it sounds like we are, after 13 years of putting forth our desire for more adequate testing and sampling out there, we're on the cusp of actually seeing that happen, perhaps, which that's a big deal.
It is a big deal, and I think it's a great time for community members to start to get involved and better understand what's going out on the site as far as sampling, as far as potential for what the site can be. And I think it's also really important because right now there's a do not consume fish advisory from the Clark Fork and Bitterroot confluence all the way down to the Flathead River.
That is a huge stretch of river.
Yeah, and it's something that many folks rely on or had previously relied on for food and things like that.
It's also evidence of a lot of bad things in the water.
Well, that's kind of where there's a divergence, too, between what our State Department of Health and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks think is risk associated with those fish and what the EPA risk assessments think the fish are saying.
So the EPA and the state aren't necessarily on the same page.
That's correct. So the state says, whoa, do not eat those fish. The fact that there's dioxins and furans and they biomagnify and move up the food chain is of great concern for the state. And yet it's not fully reflected in the Environmental Protection Agency's risk assessments.
That's a problem.
It's a problem that we're trying to get at in some ways with the additional sampling that we're asking for.
And this new day I kind of mentioned is evidence of this new day is that the EPA wants to talk to us about this level of sampling that you and other scientists have pushed for.
If I'm listening to this and I'm a resident of Missoula County or even Mineral County, really anywhere in the Clark Fork watershed, and I have an interest in wanting to do something to be involved, is there anything that I can do as a citizen of Missoula County?
If you want to learn more, you can show up to the Frenchtown Community Advisory Group's meetings. They're in Frenchtown either at the junior high or the fire department on the first Thursday of each month at 6 p.m. And they also have a Facebook page. Or you can also find the Board of County Commissioners Smurfit-Stone updates that happen quarterly.
Is there a good website where people can...
So there's a really cool ArcGIS story map that the environmental justice students put together at UM. People can reach out to me if they're interested. I'm happy if there are, larger groups of people who want to learn more, present.
You would speak to their group?
Certainly, yeah.
And how do
Thanks,
folks
Elena.
reach Elena Evans?
Evans@missoulacounty.us.
There you go. Thank you so much for coming. And as we are stealing from all kinds of other podcasters with this, before you go, could you give us some parting wisdom? Anything out there, a wide array of culture, books, movies, podcasts, anything you feel like was so noteworthy you'd like to pass on? Doesn't have to be about toxins and cleaning water. It could be about anything.
I would recommend that folks read John McPhee's Atchafalaya. It was written in 1987, but it still has a lot of relevance and pertinence today in the impacts that humans have on waterways and how that in turn impacts us.
Yeah, I would say one of the great grandfathers of awesome nonfiction writing in American letters. So thanks.
Thanks so much, Elena.
Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Elena.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Tip of the Spear podcast. If you enjoy these conversations, it would mean a lot if you would rate and review the show on whichever podcast app you like. And if you know a friend who would like to keep up with what's happening in local government, be sure to recommend this podcast to them. The Tip of the Spear podcast is made possible with support from MCAT, better known as Missoula Community Access Television, and our staff in the Missoula County Communications Division. If you have a question or topic you'd like us to address on a future episode, email it to communications@missoulacounty.us. And to find other ways to stay up to date with what's happening at Missoula County, go to missoula.co/county updates. And thanks for listening.